Hello, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. Thank you all for joining today's weekly National HoUSed call for the HoUSed campaign seeking universal, stable, and affordable housing for everyone. We'll get started in just about a half a minute here to give folks a brief second to join, but we've got a full and robust agenda, and we look forward to getting started. Just one moment. All right, everybody, let's get started. We're at 2:31 by my clock here. Really appreciate all of you taking the time today to join our national call. As you see from the agenda, we'll be covering Build Back Better Act updates from Capitol Hill and really focusing in a little bit on how some of the housing provisions from Build Back Better really impact a lot of other issues that are important to so many of us in the movement for social and economic justice. We'll then hear about some really important new research that Nlihc's team is unfolding or is unveiling on preservation of affordable housing. We'll hear some great field updates from Vermont, Indiana, and Minnesota, and then we'll talk about the rental assistance campaigns, ending rent arrears to stop evictions, before hearing from our special guest, Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, who has been a leading voice in fighting for affordable housing provisions in Build Back Better Act and in other legislation throughout his time in the Senate. So to get us started and to kick us off, I'd like to throw it open to Sarah Sadian, Nlihc's Senior Vice President for Policy, to give us the Capitol Hill update. Sarah, take it away.
Great. Hi, everybody. So nice to be with you guys today. We are seeing a very, very busy week ahead. There's a lot to share. So let's get right into it. So we know that President Biden, Speaker Pelosi, Senate Leader Schumer are working really hard to try to reach a framework for an agreement on the Build Back Better Act with the moderate Senators Sinema and Manchin. Their goal is to finalize an amendment this week so that Congress can move forward with a vote on both the bipartisan infrastructure bill and the Build Back Better Act. We know that transportation programs expire at the end of the month, so that's really the hard deadline that they're working up against. But the plan is that once there's a framework in place, the Congress can vote on the bipartisan bill and the Build Back Better Act, hopefully by the end of next week. Of course, that's a really ambitious deadline, and we've seen other deadlines that they've had get rolled over, but it does show you how much Democrats want to show that there's progress being made on these bills. We expect to see a huge push from the White House, Pelosi and Schumer, to wrap this up in the next couple of days, meaning wrapping up this framework about what is in and what is out. According to different reports, Pelosi has said 90% of everything has been agreed to. Senator Schumer just recently said the same thing this afternoon, maybe 10 minutes ago, but there are still some outstanding issues and pretty big issues that have to be resolved very soon. There's still no agreement on the top line number for Build Back Better. Manchin is still insisting on $1.5 trillion, down from $3.5 trillion. So that could have an impact on housing investments. And there's no agreement just yet with Senator Sinema on pay-fors. She says she opposes raising the corporate tax rate. Of course, the less pay-fors there are, that could also compromise housing investments. But either way, we know that by going from $3.5 trillion to $2 trillion or less, or in that ballpark, we're talking about pretty big cuts to housing investments. Earlier last week, we had heard that the $322 billion that was included in the package approved by the House Financial Services Committee, we heard that that could be slashed and only would provide up to $100 billion. Since that time, Chairwoman Waters, Chair Brown, Leader Schumer, especially Congressman Torres, have been fighting incredibly hard to try to get that number up. And I want to thank all of you for your advocacy over the last week, especially to call for the need for more housing investments. We are now seeing reports that the total allocation for that committee could be around $150 billion, maybe a little bit higher. We're going to have to see about that. But clearly, all of our advocacy has been working, and the work of our congressional champions. We really responded in the moment when we were hearing that there could have been even deeper cuts to housing, maybe could have been eliminated altogether. The fact that we are where we are is because of all of your hard work and your willingness to reach out to your members of Congress. And of course, because we have really strong champions right now who are very, very focused on getting as much housing resources as possible. And I mentioned them earlier, but just to reiterate it, you know, Maxine Waters, Richie Torres, Sherrod Brown, Chuck Schumer have been really instrumental in getting these resources up higher. This past week, we also saw Waters hold a hearing in House Financial Services to drive home the need for housing investments. We saw at least a dozen, maybe more, multi-sector organizations, meaning groups that work outside of housing. They weighed in with leadership, with the White House, in support of our top priorities. And that includes folks that work in healthcare, education, child welfare, disability justice, LGBTQ rights, and more. So thank you to them. We also saw a letter this morning from 30 faith-based organizations and nearly 40 former HUD officials, again, all in support of our top priorities with rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. So an incredible amount of work has been happening. For right now, we have a very, very short window of time to influence this package before it's finalized. We know that housing investments are at this make or break moment, and there is no guarantee just because they're talking about $150 billion that will stay in the final package. And so we're asking everybody to do one final push to try to increase these funds and make sure that they are targeted to help people with the very lowest income. I know we're making progress, but we're not there yet. And we've said this before many times, that if done correctly, if targeted to where they're needed, this could be one of the most consequential federal housing laws that we've seen in our lives, my career. And all of the work that we've done in the last couple of days, in the last weeks, in the last months, in the last many, many years has come to this moment and this opportunity. It is now or never. We do not want to let this opportunity go. And decisions are going to be made very, very soon that have an impact on where we are with housing. So what does that mean for all of you guys? If there is one more thing you can do, now is the time to do it. So if there's been some calls that you've put off to your members of Congress, or you already reached out to them and you're not sure if doing so will make an impact, now is really the time to take every single action, put everything on the table to make sure that we can get these resources in the final bill. So again, our message to members of Congress, if you're doing that outreach, and we encourage you to do that, is to ask your members to weigh in with the White House and to weigh in with Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer in support for housing investments for people with the greatest needs, including rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. At the amounts that are included in the current bill, these resources could end homelessness. This is a really significant investment that we've been waiting for a long time. And so we need to do everything that we can in this moment to make sure that we are being able to achieve everything that we want to achieve here. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Joey, see if there are any questions I can answer. And again, I just want to thank everybody for their incredible work. I know it's been exhausting the last 10 months of working on this, but we were so close and we desperately need these resources. So I thank you again for all of your work that you've put into this so far.
Thanks for that wonderful update, Sarah. And I just want to really plus one on Sarah's emphasis on how people reaching out to their members of Congress really does put us in a much stronger position. So if you haven't done so, please, when you can, reach out to your members of Congress. We have had a couple of questions in the chat box asking for some of the letters of support that you mentioned, Sarah. And I know that it looks like Elena has posted the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign partner letters. And we will also share in the follow-up to today's call and the follow-up email, the link for people to take action and to reach out to their members of Congress through our Take Action tool. And we'll also continue to share the Dear Colleague letters that were sent by Representative Richie Torres and 160 Democrats in Congress, as well as the Dear Colleague letter that was circulated by Senators Padilla and Feinstein in the Senate. So the Take Action link is actually now in the chat. Thank you so much to Elena for putting that in there. And then, so Tiffany Tran is asking Sarah, if you could please repeat the number that we are thinking maybe in the bill for housing provisions, and if you could, how that breaks down.
Yeah, it's a great question. So far, what we hear from reports and from our contacts on the Hill is that negotiations started off in a really bad place. We were hearing housing could be eliminated or deeply, deeply cut. Then we heard up to $100 billion would be provided for housing programs. Now we're hearing 150. There might be an opportunity to go a little bit higher. Of course, it's a substantial drop from $322 billion. But we were expecting cuts because we knew that the top line amount for the Build Back Better Act would go from $3.5 trillion to 2 or so. So right now it is at $150 billion. We do not know how that money is going to be split up. I think a lot of that depends on the advocacy that we're doing. I mean, our major focus is ensuring that whatever resources we get for housing, they are as targeted as possible to those who have the greatest needs. And we are encouraging the committee to focus on rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund, because those programs serve people with the lowest incomes. But we do not have any clarity right now about exactly the funding amount for each program.
Sheila Sutton asks a question here, Sarah, about if there is any money in Build Back Better Act specific to HOPWA.
That's a very good question. I do not know. I will have to get back to Sheila. Was that Sheila Sutton?
Yeah, that was Sheila.
Let me get back to Sheila about that. I do not believe so. We've been very, very laser focused, as you can tell, on our top 3 priorities, but I'll have to go back and look at the bill to see what else is in there.
And just as a reminder to everyone, those top 3 priorities are $90 million in rental assistance programs, predominantly vouchers. Oh, 90 billion. Wow, thank you. $80 billion in the public housing repairs and public housing capital, and then $37 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund. Okay, Sarah, please stick around and take a look at the Q&A box and take a look at the chat box and continue to answer questions to the extent you're able. Thank you so much for that excellent share out. I'm going to transition now to something that connects with a question that Danielle Mowry posted in the chat box, which is housing is foundational. And we're going to turn to a couple of presenters who can speak to how these housing priorities really matter in the broader movement for social and economic justice. So I'll turn now to Kira Miller. Kira is state policy outreach on the childcare team with the National Women's Law Center, and she's going to speak a little bit about how these housing investments will make a real impact for women and families throughout the United States. Kira, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Joey. I just want to first reiterate that the National Women's Law Center supports the House campaign priorities and hope to see them come to life. So I just wanted to speak a little bit about housing and childcare and how they're connected. So we know that women, children, and families do not live siloed lives. Housing is critical for families needing access to childcare and childcare providers, most of whom are women. As for home-based childcare providers, housing insecurity threatens both their ability to have a roof over their head and their livelihood. Plus, during the pandemic, many women were forced to leave the workforce because they couldn't access childcare. So it's no surprise that millions of women are behind on rent, and we need a comprehensive path forward to improve housing security for families. High housing and childcare costs and barriers to assistance exacerbate economic insecurity for many women, children, and families. Childcare is essential for parents and guardians to work or participate in job training and education. For many families, but many families cannot afford childcare. In 2018, annual costs for childcare ranged from $3,800 to $24,000, depending on the location, age of the child, and type of care provider. Let's see, I have some things here that I can send. However, I'll probably try to put them in the end because I'm not talented enough to send resources and talk at the same time. So the childcare burden is particularly acute for low-income working families and children under age 5. A family of 4 with a household income under $50,000 spends about 35% of their monthly income on childcare, compared to 7% for a family of 4 with a household income over $150,000. This cost burden often makes childcare inaccessible to women raising children on their own, who are more likely to spend the majority of their income on rent. Childcare assistance and rental assistance can help reduce these cost burdens. Unfortunately, inadequate federal funding leaves only 1 in 7 eligible families receiving childcare assistance and only 1 in 4 eligible families receiving rental assistance. We know that childcare is even harder to access for families, including homelessness, for families experiencing homelessness. The Build Back Better Act has the opportunity to reduce these funding gaps and improve access to both childcare and housing. Under BBB, the typical family in 32 states will save more than $100 a week on childcare expenses, and more than 8.2 million children could be served by the childcare and preschool proposals, which is 11 times more than those currently served. The $75 billion increase for Section 8 housing choice vouchers the House Financial Services Committee proposed would help nearly 1 million more women access this critical form of rental assistance. Keeping the National Housing Trust Fund investment would also address the shortage of rental units affordable and accessible to extremely low income renters, who are disproportionately women of color and women raising children on their own. Passing childcare assistance and rental assistance would also boost the anti-poverty impact of the Child Tax Credit, or CTC. Under the American Rescue Plan Act, eligible families started receiving advanced CTC payments of up to $300 per month for each child under age 6 and up to $250 per child ages 6 to 17. Our research shows that a majority of women of color who received a July advance CTC payment used some of it for food. Fewer women of color use CTC for rent and childcare, which makes sense. Women of color are disproportionately food insecure, and it's easier to stretch a few $100s for food over the course of a month. $300 at most per child each month isn't anywhere near enough to cover all food, rent, and childcare costs, making it critical for Congress to pass an extension of the CTC improvements and increase investments in housing and childcare assistance. We also know that many childcare workers, both home-based and center-based workers, are poorly paid, making it difficult to access affordable housing. In one survey, 63% of early childhood teaching staff reported worrying about paying for housing. Under BBB, the policy would address the childcare workforce shortage and improve working conditions by raising wages from the current $13.50 per hour to at least a living wage, with raises reaching the equivalent for elementary educators with similar credentials and experience. There would also be support for professional development. Likewise, the House campaign's investments would make it easier for childcare workers to access affordable housing and keep caring for our nation's children. These are just some of the many connections between housing and caring for our nation's children. Stay tuned for an update of our co-branded issue with Nlihc that includes some great information about these childcare and housing connections. That will replace our current issue brief in the next week or two. Our nation can build back better when we address the intersection issues women, children, and families face. We're more powerful advocating as a unit, front for housing, childcare, refundable tax credits like the CTC, healthcare, paid leave, and other priorities to address these intersecting issues. If you can include some advocacy for raising revenues, to increase tax fairness and pay for these investments, all the better. Thank you for your advocacy and holistic Build Back Better package so we can have equitable recovery for all women, children, and families. I'll give it back to Joey.
Thanks so much for that update, Karen. Thanks so much for the work that the National Women's Law Center is putting into advocacy around Build Back Better Act. You mentioned, the intersection of housing and childcare tax credits and some of the other asks that you all are working on in the bill. I'm wondering, how are you messaging to your advocates when encouraging them to take action?
So right now we keep the two separate, but we are asking our advocates to just keep pushing for everything in the bill at our priority that the number we've named. We don't want to leave anything out. It all is important. And the CTC and childcare, CTC doesn't cover enough costs for nearly anything. So that we like to keep separate from the childcare assistance. But we really push for all things.
Great. So there are a couple folks have shared in the chat about how the intersection of childcare and housing has meant something to them personally. Please feel free to hang out and take a look at the chat box and the Q&A box and answer any questions that might come in. But Kira, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I'd like to now turn it over to another key partner in our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, where we look at the intersectionality of housing and other issues. We're really pleased to have with us Khalil Shahid, who's a senior policy advisor at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Khalil, I'd love it if you could take over and share a little bit about some of the advocacy that you guys have been doing on housing priorities.
Yeah, thank you, Joey. Good afternoon, everyone. And as Joey mentioned, my name is Khalil Shahid with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm actually now Managing Director for Equity and Environmental Strategies. I was just promoted. So we are, we are an international environmental advocacy organization. Working, really across, multiple sectors, be it, energy and energy efficiency policy, conservation, but also in an area that we like to think of as community investments, standards, healthy and thriving communities, which was the program that I have been in through most of my time at NRDC now going on 8 years. And I began my work with NRDC working with a program, a project called Energy Efficiency for All, which is a national partnership between the Natural Resources Defense Council, the National Housing Trust, Elevate Energy out of Chicago, and the JPB Foundation. And that partnership was a integrated advocacy strategy, bringing together energy and environmental advocates with affordable housing advocates in 12 states across the country to advocate for improved energy efficiency and energy policies targeting the affordable housing sector, particularly the multifamily sector. But depending on what market we were working in, our focus oftentimes expanded beyond multifamily to just the broader landscape of affordable housing. And through that work, we've really, began to develop, thinking around the intersection or the need to think of housing policy as very much integrated with climate policy. When we think about actions to address climate change, we have to think beyond the energy sector. We have to think beyond sort of counting emissions. We have to think, how those investments are actually going to touch people, to reach people, and how we're actually going to spread the benefits of these investments to people, across different segments of society. And housing is one of the major ways that we're going to do that. Housing and the residential sector more broadly represents about 40% of our nation's carbon emissions, and so it's also one of our major contributors to climate change, along with transportation and industry. And those transportation emissions, the carbon emissions through transportation, is really tied to the how and the where we build our housing infrastructure. So the development patterns of our neighborhoods and communities across the country have led to a very car dependent lifestyles, which have driven up our consumption and use of fossil fuels through cars. And so there is a huge relationship in the way that we build our cities, our communities, our suburbs, how we access work, play, and other services and amenities, and how that leads to our human activities that drive climate change. And so the relationship for us, between affordable housing and climate change is both in the direct sense in how it contributes to our emissions, but also when we think about making equitable climate action, equitable climate policy, housing is again a key piece of that, because addressing the needs for affordable housing is how we're actually going to make it possible for people to participate in this clean energy economy. It's how we're actually going to reduce the cost of transition so that lower income families and working families aren't bearing the full cost of this transition, but that it's spread much more evenly. And it's really about also preserving, maintaining, and enhancing the resiliency of that housing to weather the storms due to the thresholds in carbon emissions that we've already passed, that we're seeing, manifest in extreme weather really across our country and really across the world. We're still in this space, though, when we think about climate policy, where, the focus is always really on the emissions, and we haven't really fully grasped of, what the influence, the impact, and what the need is, and how that intersection between housing policy and climate policy really manifests, and why it's important for us to really deal with both of them. And I know that sometimes, it can feel like, particularly if you're an affordable housing advocate, it can feel like, why do you have to justify your advocacy based on climate change? But I don't want you to look at it like that. There is a climate table for housing in this process that we need the affordable housing community, to really claim that space, to really throw your weight around in this conversation, because climate as a policy is different from everything else. Climate policy doesn't belong to the environmentalists. It belongs to the affordable housing community. It belongs to the unions. It belongs to the environmental justice organizations. It really belongs to all of us. And there is a table to be set to discuss both the impacts of climate on affordable housing, where if we follow business as usual, if we don't act swiftly to address climate today, we're going to see affordable housing units and properties, the number of affordable housing units and properties that are going to be at risk of flood damage are going to triple over the next 20 years. And so, if we don't act on this issue, we're going to see both the cost of housing increase, we're going to see the vulnerability of housing to extreme weather increase, and we're going to see much more displacement, both due to climate, but also to the negative impacts of the investments that are going to be flowing in to try to solve the climate crisis. If we're not careful about how we do that, if we don't have the affordable housing resources available and necessary to support and maintain affordability while we're investing in transitioning our infrastructure, investing in transitioning our communities and retrofitting the suburbs to be much more climate resilient, we're going to be at risk of displacing millions of people, really across this country. And again, you just have to look at, situations and scenarios. I'm from New Orleans, but we can look at cases, Houston, in New York after Sandy, when affordable housing gets flooded, when affordable housing is damaged due to hurricane winds or fire, it is often the least or the last bit of housing that is then redeveloped. And so it is very critical for us to support advocacy and the build out of these resources and these programs. And there are natural alliances. We are a partner also, similar to here with the Opportunity Starts at Home Coalition. NRDC is one of the founding partners of the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform, which is a partnership between a lot of the larger environmental organizations and some of the national and local environmental justice organizations. And they've been on the Hill, same as everyone else, advocating and demanding policies and priorities to be met through the Build Back Better program, and many of the same issues that we're talking about here today: the National Housing Trust, LIHTC, the Public Housing Capital Fund. Those issues are also on their list, and they're also at the table advocating for those same resources, the same resources that you're advocating for. And so there are natural allies for the affordable housing movement in the environmental justice movement that need to be nurtured, because we cannot address climate without also addressing the housing crisis, and vice versa. The housing crisis and the build out of our communities has also driven and led to our climate crisis. And so they're deeply intertwined. And I'll stop there because I know that Joey and others may have questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Khalil. Actually, I think toward the end of your remarks there, you kind of hit on one of the questions that came in. Jerry was asking, why are there so few climate organizations stepping up towards ensuring affordable homes for all? But maybe it sounded like you were saying, Khalil, actually a lot of environmental organizations are where you are at NRDC, or do you think is there work that advocates need to do to get more climate change organizations on board?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more work to be done. We can step in and advocate for specific policies. But if you look at, again, if we look at really, the sausage, the nuts and bolts of how this Build Back Better policy was being developed, a lot of what you hear about in the news is the issues with Joe Manchin and his disagreement with the SEP program, the Clean Energy Performance Program. And so we're all scrambling, trying to figure out, okay, without the Clean Energy Performance Program, how can we meet the administration's emissions target, which was to reduce our nation's carbon emissions 50% by 2030. And so now we're trying to scramble to find other programs that we can plug into place to meet that target. And in that conversation, again, the focus is on emissions, whereas, okay, but how do you actually, secure people's livelihoods, through that emissions transition? How do we reach those emissions without, while making sure that we're not increasing the cost of housing for people who can ill afford it? Those two conversations aren't being integrated. So, the focus is just on the emissions. And so we still have a lot more work to do to make sure that we're able to have a much more holistic conversation. And part of that comes from the environmental community, but also part of that has to come from the affordable housing community stepping to the table and saying, wait a minute, climate is our issue. It's not your issue. It's not just for the environmentalists. It's not just about emissions, but it's about the places where we live, work, and play. And that really is about housing. And there's also the issue, again, when we talk about equitable climate policy in the socio-economic sense, what we are really trying to do is to say, we need our response to climate change to be very labor intensive. We want to be able to put people to work. We don't want to just focus on, the lowest cost, the highest value technologies that are actually going to displace people from work. Retrofitting homes is where the majority of the work in addressing climate change is going to come from. And so anytime any politician, any president gets on TV and talks about clean energy jobs, they need to talk about housing right after that, because the majority of those jobs are going to be in retrofitting housing. It's going to be in fixing, our lead service lines. It's going to be in, caulking and putting in, new windows, et cetera, HVAC systems. And so there is housing should demand its space and its voice in this conversation. I was really disappointed when when the president announced the cabinet members who were going to be joining him at the UN climate conference in early November, and Marcia Fudge was not one of them. That's an oversight. That's because they're not actually fully, understanding the role and the importance of housing, not just as, not just as a way to reduce emissions, but how you make this transition affordable for people, to get through it. And so solving the housing crisis has to go in tandem with our climate crisis.
Thanks, Khalil. This has been a really great share out. I'll call attention to a couple of questions that are in the Q&A box and in the chat box. Andrew Fuller has a really good question on new dollars and whether or not you think there's preferences on rebuilding in place versus targeting new areas that are more climate change resilient. Please take a look in the Q&A box and take a look in the chat box and answer as many of those questions as you can. We'd really appreciate that. But thank you, Khalil, for joining us and for sharing all of these excellent thoughts and excellent resources. With that, we're going to move on in our agenda, and we'll talk a little bit about some new research from our excellent research team and one of our wonderful researchers, Dan Emanuel, who will talk a bit about the Picture of Preservation report. Dan, please take it away.
Hey, thanks, Joey. And next slide, please. So for folks who might not be familiar, we co-manage something called the National Housing Preservation Database with PARC, which is a research organization up in Connecticut. And essentially, the NHPD is a fully deduplicated property level database of federally assisted housing. And the database allows users to identify virtually any federal project-based rental subsidy associated with an affordable housing property, along with a whole host of other variables. And there are a bunch of research applications for NHPD data, but it's particularly useful for studying preservation factors like exit and depreciation risks. And Picture of Preservation, or POP as we like to call it, is an annual report where we use the NHPD to characterize the state of preservation for the whole federally assisted stock, or at least the project-based stock. And this year we framed the report really in terms of documenting the need for Build Back Better. Next slide, please. So there are nearly 5 million federally assisted homes, which account for about 10% of the entire US rental housing stock. And these homes provide security for millions of families and people who might otherwise be homeless, including many seniors and people with disabilities. And like any infrastructure, this housing isn't really a one-time investment. It requires sustained reinvestment to ensure affordability, future affordability and habitability as the building's age and existing affordability and income restrictions come up for renewal or extension. So Congress, in other words, really has an obligation to both existing and future federally assisted housing tenants. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the first finding I wanted to share about preservation risks. Here you can see the affordability restrictions are set to expire for over 745,000 federally assisted homes in the next decade, and for over 312,000 homes just in the next 5 years. And most of these homes are supported either by LIHTC or project-based Section 8. And many of these homes that will be preserved with contract renewal or further capital subsidy, but some of these homes will not be preserved. So kind of the rest of the report is actually about identifying the scope of that, or measuring the scope of what won't be preserved or what will be preserved. So next slide, please. So of course, there's also, in addition to expiring subsidies and affordability restrictions, there's also this threat of physical deterioration. So our data are a little more limited when it comes to directly assessing housing quality in the stock. Our best resource for that really is REACT scores, and those are collected for about less than half of the stock. But from those REACT scores, we know that about 23% of public housing homes and just about 4% of homes assisted by project-based Section 8 actually failed their last REACT inspection. So there's some real housing quality issues in the public housing stock, as evidenced by the REACT scores and the large capital needs backlog in public housing, which I may have a typo about there. I think it's actually 70 billion. But we also know the LIHTC stock is getting older, and many of those properties haven't received subsequent reinvestments either. So it's not just an issue. Physical quality is also an issue for the tax credit stock, and a growing one at that. because it's getting older. So slide 6, or next slide, please. So in addition to broadly looking at preservation risks in the report, we also estimated what's been lost or preserved in the stock. So in recent years, we estimated over 44,000 federally assisted homes have been lost, while almost 130,000 homes were actually preserved, which is pretty good, right? So most of these homes seem to be getting preserved, but we're still losing a sizable chunk, as time progresses every year. So we also looked at historic trends in tax credit preservation, and we found approximately 143,000 homes that had been awarded a LIHTC subsidy since 1990 lost their affordability restrictions early, so before year 30, right? And about 114,000 of these homes may have exited through the qualified contract loophole in the program, which is a bit higher than previous estimates. But all in all, based on recent trends, we estimate perhaps over 176,000 federally assisted units could be lost from the affordable stock over the next 5 years if we don't significantly expand preservation resources. Next slide, please. So if I haven't already made it clear, federally assisted housing it's not a one-time investment, right? It's vital infrastructure that requires sustained reinvestment, and Build Back Better provides exactly that. So most importantly, it provides historic investments in public housing capital needs, which I outlined for you earlier, the Housing Trust Fund, which can be used to actually preserve these units, and then of course vouchers. And all of these programs directly support the preservation of the existing stock and the stability of its tenants, right? Build Back Better will also close the qualified contract loophole, which I mentioned earlier, and provide some other really important investments in multifamily preservations. And you can read all about that and also a much deeper dive on RAD and some other preservation issues in this year's report. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joey.
Much, Dan. Thanks so much, Dan. This is a really exciting report, and I think those are really usable infographics. I'll remind everybody who's mentioned it in the chat box that we do share these slides and the materials, including the report, in the follow-up email that everyone will see tomorrow. And so, Dan, if you can take a look at the chat box as well. I have one question. This came in from Marlo Klein. Is the housing quality data and projected losses able to be broken down by geography?
Yeah, we can do that. We can do some special tabulations of what's in the report. So I'll reach out to you and we can put something together if you have a particular area you want to look at. Are
you talking about by state or by county?
Any level, really, actually.
Oh, wow. That's excellent.
All the way down to, it's a property level database, so we can look down even to the property level.
Michael Deppland in Texas asks the question, is there a reason REACT scores aren't given to all public subsidized housing?
It's like public housing, all the HUD multifamily programs is my understanding. The big chunk that we're missing though is we don't have it for a lot of tax credit housing, unless that tax credit housing also has like a HUD subsidy associated with it.
And Stephen asks, are there links that we have to federally assisted multifamily projects that are at risk state by state? I'm wondering if the preservation database is the best answer to that question.
The preservation database is certainly the best answer to that, but we've also, for this report, we developed some interactive maps where you can go and you'll actually look at the property level at all these different properties. So I'll put a link to that in the chat box so people can check it out.
Please do. And then one final question before I ask you to turn your attention to the chat box. Do we have any data? Do you have any data on preservation success in communities where property values are rapidly increasing and gentrification is rampant? Do we have any recommendations on best practices for preservation in those communities?
We didn't specifically look at that in the report, but what I would say is if you want us to take a look at, we did do some level of historical analysis in this report, so we would potentially be able to help somebody take a look at changes in the assisted stock over time in their community, which could speak to some of the changes that are happening along with the rest of the rental housing market. So I'll check the chat box and I'll reach out to whoever had that question. We can have a more in-depth conversation about how to address that.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dan, for that presentation. Do hang out in the chat box for a little bit and take a look at the Q&A box, because I think other questions are going to continue to trickle in, but really appreciate you taking the time. And with that, I think we will now turn our attention to some brief field updates. We're going to start with Natalie James, who is the coalition builder at Prosperity, Indiana, to share about some of the recent things that they've been working on. And I'll turn it over right now to Natalie.
Thanks, Joey, and thanks everyone for having me on today. Really appreciate this opportunity to share this awesome work. So about a year ago, Prosperity, Indiana decided to adapt a reading guide for the book Evicted. And this reading guide we adapted also connected to a 3-part webinar series on eviction that we did. And we've had incredible success with this reading guide. It's been something we've been able to keep on our Housing for Hoosiers website as a resource for folks. It includes data on eviction in Indiana. It includes a guide on like how to read the book Evicted, equipped with questions and data that's specific to Indianapolis and Indiana in general. We've been able to share it with folks from religious groups to folks just doing book clubs at their jobs. Evicted is a great book for folks who are really interested in what the realities of eviction look like. And of course, last year, with the eviction, the CDC eviction moratorium, a lot of those issues kind of came to the surface for folks who wouldn't typically be privy to those issues. And so this was perfectly timed, and we were able to use this as a resource to share with folks. So I believe someone is dropping the link to the reading guide in the chat. If anyone needs a resource to really kind of share in terms of education, it's pretty great for that. It's, you know, every group we've spoken to, from librarians to religious groups to actually speaking to a group of AmeriCorps members this week about the reading guide and the book. It's a great way to get folks involved in the coalitions and in the advocacy. Of course, the book is very dense. There's a lot of information, and this reading guide is a great way to kind of break some of that stuff down. We actually were able to adapt it from a book club study guide from a group in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. They were so gracious enough to allow us to adapt it. And we just kind of want to spread the word so that if anyone else is interested in adapting this to their own city or state, please feel free and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing about this reading guide. And I think it's an excellent idea to capitalize on the popularity and really the phenomenon that has been Evicted. I wonder how much in your reading guide are you directing people to what some next steps are?
So the last few pages on our reading guide, we actually have local resources. So Indiana Legal Services, Christian Legal Clinic, different things like that, where people can actually go and get help. And of course, Prosperity Indiana, if they actually had to sign up to get this reading guide. So we have their information, and when they get it, we invite them to Hoosier Housing Needs Coalition meetings, Opportunity Sites at Home meetings, and things of that nature. So there's a next step there, so they can find more information. And of course, if they're already reading the book Evicted, if they're using this reading guide, then that's an even better, segue into advocacy meetings.
Yeah, thank you so much, Natalie, for providing this excellent resource. And for everybody on the call, please know that a link to the reading guide has been put into the chat box and will be in the follow-up notes. And so, Natalie, please hang out in case folks have any questions about the reading guide and how it came together. And then you can also take a look at the Q&A box and see if there are any questions to answer there. So I would like to turn it over to our next field update. We're very lucky to have with us Sue Watlaw Phillips, who is the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Interfaith Coalition for Affordable Housing and is also the Board President of the National Coalition for Homeless. Sue is going to share about some rallies that they did for Bring America Home Now. Last week, one of the rallies she worked on in Minnesota, but also the rallies that were coordinated throughout the country by the National Coalition for Homeless. One even taking place here in DC that I believe my colleague Sarah was able to present at. But Sue has a lot of great information, and Sue, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much, Joey, and thank you to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for the incredible work that you've done throughout the years, and especially around the HoUSed campaign too. I've been working on housing and homeless issues for over 54 years in a variety of different settings, and I just want to echo what Sarah said earlier, that this is one of our greatest opportunities in our lifetime to really address in preventing and ending homelessness for the vast majority of Americans. So encourage you to be very actively involved in the advocacy, continue to be involved, and especially over the next couple of weeks. And for those of you that are people of faith, encourage you to remember that with men, things are impossible, but with God, all things are possible. So as a person of faith, I've been praying a great deal and asking all the folks that I know across the country to also pray. As Joey mentioned, the National Coalition for the Homeless, along with Micah, spearheaded the Bring America Home Now campaign, a comprehensive grassroots campaign to end homelessness in the US. It's led by people experiencing homelessness, which I also experienced when I was a teenager. And our focus is to pass federal legislation aimed at addressing the interconnected solutions that we've been talking about today to the 5 decades long of growing homelessness in the United States. The campaign focuses on 6 major policy areas. Housing is a human right, so the HoUSed campaign is a major portion of that and is a member. National Income Housing is one of our partners in the campaign. That health, that a safe, stable home is a prerequisite of health and well-being. That livable incomes are essential to prevent and end homelessness to ensure stability in housing. That education and training equips people with the knowledge and skills needed to be able to do the economic mobility they'd like to. The civil rights, that homelessness is a civil rights issue, and people experiencing homelessness should not be criminalized or victims of hate crimes. And racial equity, that homelessness is a racial equity justice issue in the United States, and racial equity is a key to housing justice. So you can see with the Build Back Better Act is that many of the provisions that we have in the Bring America Home campaign are a part of that. And so we are very supportive of the entire act as it's moving together. And of course, we need to save the planet to be able to live successfully here on this planet too. So very supportive of all the climate work that's being done too. So in the chat, I believe there's been a link that has been put to give you the pieces of Bring America Home Now campaign. So if you want to look at that, encourage you to join the campaign, as well as a link to our Facebook page that will bring you to the rally in Washington, DC that we had last Wednesday, where we were honored again to have Chair Maxine Waters be one of the keynote speakers at the conference, at that rally, press conference and rally. So we had rallies across the nation. They were both in person at capitals across the nation, as well as virtual. And so in Minnesota, I'm going to ask if we can have the first slide put up. So Representative Alice Hausman, who's the chair of our Finance and Policy Committee in our Minnesota House of Representatives, was our keynote presenter. Our next speaker then was Milton Manning, if you want to go to the next slide. And Milton is a formerly homeless veteran. He's working with us in the Trusted Messenger program around COVID-19 vaccine. And then if you want to go to the next slide. Janelle Freeman Anderson is the founder and president of Freedom from the Streets and No More Streets. They also are part of the Bring America Home Now campaign. She is also formerly homeless. These are organizations that are organizing people that have experienced homelessness and housing crisis to speak on their own behalf. And then the next slide. I guess go one more. Gary Kwong, who is the board president of the MICA, the Metropolitan Interfaith Council on Affordable Housing. He's been working on racial equity and training across United Church of Christ nationally for the last 2 decades. And then finally, we have this picture of homeless. And if you want to go to the next slide. So I ended the rally with basically ripping that apart, where you saw the scissors cutting that, and basically saying that we don't need to be talking about less. What we need to be talking about is a home, a safe, decent, accessible home that is affordable for everyone. And it's not that we don't have enough resources to do that. We do have the resources in this country to ensure that everyone has a home. And so as it says on the front of the podium, a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., where he said, we know how to end poverty in this country. The real key is, do we have the will to do that? So we hope that through these rallies and through all of our advocacy, that we will all come together and build back better and make sure that everyone has a home. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sue, for sharing about this really important rally. And thank you also for that excellent image that you shared at the end, talking specifically about separating out home from less and how we engage on policy. One question I wanted to ask is, you clearly had great buy-in for your event from leadership in the Minnesota legislature. Do you find that when they're presenting to your audience, they make commitments to be supportive of the 6 pillars? And is that something that you feel like you need to follow up on with them, or do you really already have them in the bag at this point?
Well, I will never say, Joey, that I think that we have everything in the bag in Minnesota or anywhere, but I can say that Chair Hausman is a woman of faith, and she talked very passionately around all the 6 pillars and is very supportive of the legislation and authors most of our legislation in Minnesota.
And for the Bring Home Now campaign, Bring America Home Now campaign, do you have any asks that are specific to Minnesota?
So part of the work that, I mean, obviously all of the Bring America Home campaign would help all of America. Some of the work that Micah has been working on, in addition to really focused on housing for people that have incomes of less than 30%. And Janelle talks about that all the time, as well as Micah, and making sure that we have livable incomes, is that we also want to make sure that we are addressing the lead paint issue. 1 in 3 homes in Minnesota, and a very high percentage of older homes across the United States has lead paint still in it. And so we have a lot of kids that are being exposed to lead paint poisoning, as well as in the American Rescue Plan and in other legislation, as was talked about earlier, is that we have lead in our pipes. And so these are other major issues that Mike has been working with families that have experienced lead poisoning of their children that have become disabled.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Sue, for your work and for this update. There's some appreciation being expressed for you in the chat, and I think a request for your contact info. So please take a look at that and take a look at if anything pops up in the Q&A box. But thank you for a lot of your excellent organizing in Minnesota and nationwide. We really appreciate it. I'd like to turn it over now to our third and final field update for the week. This one comes from Lindsay Thrall at Evernorth, Vermont. And if we can move the slide, there's Lindsay. Lindsay is the Connections Program Manager, and I would like for Lindsay to please take it away.
Thank you, Joey, and thanks everybody for being here. And I'm excited to talk about this interview survey program project we did. Evernorth is a syndicator of affordable housing in Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, and is an owner, a co-owner, and developer of affordable housing in Vermont. And we did this survey project based on a project that the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition had done. We interviewed a group of residents, the same residents, for a 6-month span. We interviewed January through May, and then skipped a couple months and interviewed again in August. And we did a total of 147 phone interviews with residents. They lasted from 5 or 10 minutes to about an hour a piece, depending on how much the resident had to talk about. And we recorded the interviews, transcribed them all, and then our intern and I, Jed Sass, who did the bulk of the interviews, sat together and talked about common themes that had come up. So much like the interview project in Maine, we heard from our residents that they paid rent first before they did anything else. And what that meant for them was that a lot of people ended up, when their incomes were down, in the height of the pandemic, It meant that they were using credit cards to make up the difference. They were depleting savings accounts, and they were skipping bills. We had one mother who was a caregiver for 5 children tell us that she knew they would be okay if they ate a really small breakfast and 1 big meal a day, but she knew that they wouldn't be okay if they became homeless. And we did hear that fear of homelessness come through loud and clear when people talked about the reasons that they paid their rent first. Sometimes even when people applied for rent relief, they would still kind of pay their rent in the meantime because they weren't sure if they were going to get it. I had one person tell me, she's like, if I skip a month and I don't get the rent relief, I am then behind 2 months and I can't do that. So she was another person who had to skip bills to make ends meet while waiting for her rent relief. And so when we talk about like the trend that we saw, when we started our interviews in January, we had quite a few people skipping bills, using credit cards, et cetera. And that decreased over the next few months down to a low in kind of the late spring, early summer. And that was because a lot of people had stimulus payments coming in. They had tax returns, that it was the height of the pandemic relief programs. And we felt like the people we were talking to were pretty darn stable during that time in that kind of late spring, early summer. By the time we circled back in August to talk to people again, they were talking about feeling the squeeze again. A lot of people had gone back to work, but a lot of those programs had decreased or gone away. And then a ton of people talked about the squeeze of increased prices this fall. And so we did see a bump in people's need to skip bills, need to use credit cards to make ends meet, which is too bad. So another thing we heard a lot of was just this kind of undercurrent of shame about applying for rent relief programs and other COVID relief programs. I had one person tell me, like, I don't think that I should apply for 3 Squares Vermont, which is our SNAP program. She said, I don't think I should apply because I feel like that's for families. And she was a single adult. She said, I think that I don't want to take food out of a child's mouth. So we did hear that quite a bit, that feeling like maybe I don't think this is for me. I don't think I need it enough. We also talked to people who didn't really realize they qualified. Jed talked to somebody who made $100 a month and thought that because she made $100 a month and not $0 a month, she wouldn't qualify for 3 Squares Vermont. And so we did refer all of these families kind of on an individual level to services to try to get them connected. But we also realized that we really need a better way to connect with our residents. Not all of our partners have ways of doing mass communication in an efficient way. So we're working on solutions for that. And we also encouraged housing managers to reach out to everybody and not just people who had arrears, because we really feel like there were probably a lot of people who hadn't reached out and asked for help because of those reasons that I already mentioned. So we wanted to make sure that we reached out to everybody and that everyone knew that these programs are for them. So in closing, I would just say we're really grateful to the people who gave us their time and shared their stories with us. And if you're interested in reading more about it, we've got the full reports up on our website, which I think we're going to drop a link to in the chat. And then I think I will turn it back over to Joey.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for this excellent share out. I've got one question that just came into the Q&A box about to what extent when conducting this survey, were you measuring how emergency rentals making a difference and collecting the stories on how emergency rental assistance bettered people's lives beyond just housing stability, but also maybe their mental health and so forth?
Yeah, we did ask that question, how many people got rent housing assistance, and we did try to collect that information about what difference it made for them. Some of that is in our reports, so you can go look. There weren't, to be honest, there weren't a ton of people in our survey group that got it, just a handful, but it did really matter to those who got it. It really took a lot of the pressure off, I would say.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Lindsay. There are likely going to be additional questions and requests coming into the chat box and the Q&A box, so please take a look. And please feel free to drop in any links to your report if they're not already in there as placed by some of our staff. But thank you so much for this excellent survey and for sharing about it on our call today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
And with that, we're going to transition away from field updates, and we will turn now to NLIHC's focus on emergency rental assistance and the Erase campaign, ending rent arrears to stop evictions. We've got two of our staff members who are going to share about their important work on Erase. We're going to start with Emma Foley, our research analyst, to discuss some of the new numbers. Emma, take it away. Emma, we can't hear you. You might be muted. Emma?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Thank you, Emma.
Great.
Please start over.
Sorry about that. If you could, oh, that's perfect. Okay, so today I'll be providing an update on ERA spending. Today around noon Eastern time, the Department of the Treasury released updated spending data for ERA grantees. The data is current up through September 30th, which is a particularly important benchmark because it marks the date by which the Department of Treasury will consider whether grantees have excess funds for recapture and reallocation. I'll have a more in-depth overview next week, but for today, I'll just highlight some of the broad trends, as well as some of the state grantees at potential risk of reallocation. By the end of September, ERA grantees had spent nearly $10 billion of the $25 billion ERA1 allocation. Grantees spent $2.6 billion of ERA1 in September alone, which is the highest month to date, though it's not significantly higher than August when grantees spent $2.48 billion. Some ERA2 funds have also been dispersed, and we will cover those next week. Next slide. According to Treasury guidance, grantees who did not obligate at least 65% of their ERA funding or who spent less than 30% of their funding for financial assistance as of the end of September will be determined to have excess funds. So though we don't have data on obligation rates for each grantee, the amount spent on financial assistance, known as the expenditure ratio, is published by Treasury. According to the most recent data released today, 32 state grantees did not reach the 30% expenditure ratio as of the end of September. Those are, all 32 of those are listed here, ordered from the lowest expenditure rate ratio upwards. Treasury does outline some what they call mitigating factors that will allow grantees more time to meet this expenditure ratio. This includes things like submitting a program improvement plan or reaching the spending benchmark by mid-November. But of particular concern are grantees that are not even close to the 30% ratio, especially large states with high renter populations. So those include states like Arizona, Georgia, Tennessee, and Ohio. Next slide. Several states continue to spend quickly and others have recently ramped up their spending, with 10 states having an expenditure ratio over 50%. New Jersey is the first state to spend all of their funding for financial assistance, and the District of Columbia is also close behind. Next slide. Nlihc continues to track ERA spending using the most current data available, including dashboards, news articles, and communication with program administrators, in addition to the Treasury data. As of this morning, we are tracking over $11 billion that has been spent or obligated of ERA1 funding. This doesn't yet include the most recent Treasury data, since it was just released today, but we'll work on integrating that data in the next day or so and update all of our spending tracking accordingly. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, Treasury's reallocation process will begin based on September's spending and obligation rates. I've gone ahead and just linked here from the Treasury reallocation guidance, as well as NLIHC's fact sheet for more information on reallocation. And though we've mostly focused on what grantees are at risk of recapture, there are other grantees that will be receiving additional funds through the reallocation process. Treasury has yet to release additional guidance on how grantees can apply for these additional funds, but several states and localities have already expressed interest in these additional funds and are sending letters to Treasury to explain the need in their area. So far, these include the state of New York, District of Columbia, and Philadelphia. And I've linked news articles as well as those letters here, which will be sent out in an email following the call. But we will also continue to track which states and jurisdictions are seeking additional funds to serve renters through the reallocation process. Next slide. And then lastly, as always, we provide more detailed spending data for state programs and programs with dashboards at bit.ly/ERA-spending. And you can, if you know of any additional data that we should include, we'd be happy to receive it at research@nlihc.org. And additionally, if you have any questions about our resources or about spending data in general, do feel free to reach out to us there as well. And I will pass it, I think I'll be passing it on to Jade or back to Joey to discuss the Erase website.
Yeah, right before we go to Jade, there was one question that came into the chat box, Emma, that I wanted to ask, which is there a specific way that we recommend folks track the ERA2 funding? Is it a website that you were just listing, or is there anything else that folks should be aware of?
For ERA2 funding, it was just released last month, and we noticed some discrepancies in the data, but we will begin publishing that likely in the next couple weeks as well. But for people interested in ERA2 funding now for their states and localities, you can take a look at Treasury's Excel document, which publishes data for each grantee, and I'll go ahead and link that in the chat.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Emma. And yes, let's now turn it over to Jade Vasquez, one of the other assets on our Erase team. Jade, take it away.
Thanks, Joey. So we on the Erase team are excited to announce the launch of the Erase webpage, and I'm here today to discuss some of the content of the Erase webpage. Next slide, please. So the End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions, or Erase project, is Nlihc's national effort to ensure that the historic $46.5 billion appropriated by Congress reaches the lowest income and most marginalized renters. The website builds on Nlihc's Erase call to action, which aims to ensure that state and local emergency rental assistance programs are visible, accessible, and preventive. It includes resources for tenants, state and local housing advocates, policymakers, researchers, and ERA program administrators, like the Erase checklist and the Erase assessment tool that ERA programs can reference when developing their own program improvement plans. Next slide, please.
Jade, I'm actually going to interrupt you briefly. Looking forward to you completing this excellent share out, but I was just told that Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon has joined the call, and I know he only has a couple of minutes for us today. So I think we're going to turn it over to Senator Merkley. By way of introduction, I can share with all of you that Senator Merkley is a strong champion for affordable housing, most recently leading a major push to ensure comprehensive housing investments stay in the Build Back Better Act. Senator Merkley, along with Senators Padilla and Feinstein of California, led a Dear Colleague letter that we mentioned earlier in the call. It was signed by 36 senators, and this letter called for the inclusion of robust housing investments in the reconciliation package. This June, Senator Merkley introduced the Affordable Housing Opportunities Made Equitable Act, or the HOME Act, a comprehensive bill that would provide significant resources and protections for tenants, and these are some of the changes that were called for in the HoUSed campaign. So we only have a couple of minutes from Senator Merkley, and Senator, if you're on, please take it away.
Thank you, Joey, very much, and a huge thank you to all of you at the coalition. You are fighting to make sure that Congress pays attention and we don't miss this historic opportunity to address America's housing needs with the Build Back Better Act. Your president and CEO, Diane Yentl, she was absolutely right when she said that if we do this right, it could be the most consequential federal housing bill any of us have seen in our lifetimes. But if we do it wrong, or we don't do it at all, it's going to be decades before we have a similar opportunity. So let's do it right. We cannot let this historic moment slip through our fingers. Because like all of you, I believe that every single American deserves a decent place to live in a decent neighborhood. That has been a guiding light since I first worked for Habitat for Humanity, and then when I developed affordable housing for another nonprofit called Human Solutions. We've got a once in a generation opportunity with this bill, Build Back Better, to make investments that all of us have been fighting for a very long time. And I think as we look at the arc of the last 2 decades, we know that things are much worse now than they were 20 years ago in terms of the backlogs and the unfulfilled demand, the frustrating increases in prices. I know I've been very concerned as I've heard the conversation about Build Back Better and the bill going from 6 trillion to 3.5 trillion to somewhere in the vicinity of 2 trillion, and what's the impact that is having on the conversation about affordable housing. And so the way we sustain a significant slice of this bill is your advocacy. So thank you for that advocacy. You all have seen the skyrocketing rents. I've seen them. We've seen the very slow supply of units. We've had vacancy rates in places in Oregon that have been 1% to 2%. And it's just putting the goal of stable and affordable housing further and further out of reach for too many working and middle class Americans. Home ownership is certainly slid away from the opportunity. When my parents bought their home, my dad was a mechanic. He was a union mechanic, and the home cost twice what he earned in a year. Now, the cost of a single family home is about 4 times, a simple, typical single family home, about 4 times greater than the median household income. And rents, wow. You know, since 1960, average earnings have risen 5%, but rents 61%. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to recognize that when your income goes up 5%, but the costs go up 61%, we're in trouble. Another way of putting it is an American worker earning the federal minimum wage has to work 127 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Well, that speaks for itself. It's an impossibility. Waiting lists for public housing, 13 months to 8 years. Only a fraction of families who are eligible actually end up receiving vouchers. And sometimes, I know this is certainly true in parts of Oregon, you get the voucher, you can't find an apartment that qualifies for that voucher. So, sum up, the state of public housing is in dire condition, but thanks to your advocacy, your input, we have an understanding of the solutions we need to pursue. We've got to expand rental assistance. We have to preserve public housing. We have to invest in the National Housing Trust Fund that serves families earning less than 30% of median household income. We have to expand, strengthen the low-income housing tax credit. And so instrumental in launching the construction of affordable housing across the country. And I developed a number of housing complexes for a nonprofit using LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. But this understanding of the importance and foundation of housing is not something every member of Congress innately understands. And that's where your advocacy comes in. I saw at Habitat for Humanity when a family was stabilized with a home they could afford, and I saw it with the rental housing developed, that it was a dramatic change for the children. Children did better in school. They had more pride in their home. They actually had a place to invite people over. They felt like part of the community. Their parents felt like part of the community. They got invested and involved in other activities in the community. All of these things were very positive for the path of children growing up. Housing is the essential foundation for thriving families. So that's the message I encourage you to keep taking to members of Congress in these critical few weeks. Like I wrote in my recent letter to the administration, which has noted dozens of my fellow senators signed on to invest in American families, we must invest in the homes and communities where those families live. As we work to create Build Back Better package, we must make investments in housing opportunity a central pillar of the plan. Because, as evicted author Matthew Desmond wrote last week, the success of all other opportunity expanding initiatives depends on it. That's the end of the quote. So there it is. I'm going to keep fighting. I'm asking you all to keep fighting. We know that key decisions are being made in the next few days about how much of this final Build Back Better bill that can pass the Senate is going to be invested in housing. Your advocacy last week helped put housing back on the charts. We started the week with something closer to 100 billion and finished it with 150 to 175 billion. That's only half of what we were talking about. We were talking about a $3.5 trillion bill. So we got to keep pushing, got to keep advocating, keep up the fire, keep the passion burning. So that's the way that we maximize the results that will help all of you be successful in your mission in creating a decent home and a decent community for every family. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for the invitation to talk to you, and take care.
Thanks so much, Senator Merkley. A lot of appreciation for you in our chat box today from attendees on the call, including Megan from Habitat for Humanity of Oregon chiming in, and thank you for your work. May I ask, from where you sit, there's a lot of folks right now in the advocacy community reaching out to senators and representatives about the Build Back Better Act. For influencing the senators in these final moments, what messaging do you think is really going to make our advocacy stand out? What do you think will have the most impact?
Bringing the stories of families you work with to the senators in your state will have the biggest impact. We can talk statistics, we can look at charts, but when we frame it in terms of the experience you've all had, seeing lives transform, and if you can, give first names, or if you're allowed to use full names and tell people's stories that you've been given permission to do, convey those stories. I think about one family I worked with who had been living in basements and borrowed bedrooms in a number of houses, and the two daughters were so shy. And when they finally had a stable house to live in, they blossomed. And they started coaching their mother in ways that she had never anticipated, that helped her do better as well. And so bring those stories to bear. And I don't think there's a House or Senate member out there that, if reminded about it, doesn't realize we're in much worse shape than we were 20 years ago. We got a lot of mileage to make up. And so this is the moment. We're not going to have another moment like this. Isn't like, oh, well, the next appropriation bill, we can catch up. No, this is the moment. We must seize this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Merkley. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your leadership. And
thank you, John.
Have a great day.
I appreciate all of you. Take care now.
And with that, we will resume the update from Jade Vasquez on the Erase team, and hopefully May can remember which slide we were on. I think that's it. Jade, take it away.
Sure. So Nlihc is currently providing funding and technical assistance to 35 state and local nonprofit partners who meet bi-weekly to share best practices and advance strategies, policies, and legislation that accelerate equitable distribution of emergency rental assistance funds, promote tenant protections, and ultimately prevent evictions. And so the website highlights current and past efforts, including reports, presentations, and briefings conducted by members of the Erase cohort. Next slide, please. The Erase website also highlights Nlihc's federal advocacy work, including letters to Congress and the Biden administration. It also includes information on the advocacy efforts and victories occurring at the state and local levels. So you can learn more about that work by clicking on the Advocacy and Action tab. Next slide, please. And one specific resource on the Advocacy and Action page that I want to highlight is the state and local ERA tenant protections database, which the Erase team developed in collaboration with Nlihc state and local partners. The database is a resource of ERA tenant protections that have been passed in the last year. It includes policies, legislation, ordinances, executive orders, and court orders that cities, counties, and states across the country have enacted to protect marginalized renters and prevent a wave of evictions that could be catastrophic during a global pandemic. The tenant protections listed, oh, can you go back to the slide? Thank you. The tenant protections listed in this database include extended eviction moratoriums, recent source of income discrimination laws, right to counsel legislation, sealed evictions records legislation, and others. Each tenant protection includes the state, jurisdiction, bill of ordinance number, a short description of the law and policy, and a link to the legal text. Researchers, policymakers, and housing advocates can look to this resource to inform local advocacy efforts and encourage elected officials in their respective jurisdictions to pass similar tenant protections. Nlihc will regularly update the state and local ERA tenant protections database as we learn about the passage of new laws and policies. And so if you know any recent legislation passed in your city, county, or state, please share with the Erase team by contacting me at jvasquez@nlihc.org. Next slide, please. Finally, the Erase website compiles existing Nlihc research, reports, and dashboards on ERA. The ERA Resource Hub offers examples of how programs are incorporating best practices like self-attestation and direct-to-tenant payments to enhance equity and efficiency within their ERA programs. It also includes the Nlihc ERA Spending Tracker, ERA Dashboard, and links to updated Treasury guidance and accompanying Nlihc fact sheets and summaries. Next slide, please. And so we at Nlihc hope that the Erase website can be a one-stop shop for the most up-to-date information on ERA to ensure that emergency rental assistance reaches renters with the greatest need and to support members' efforts in developing long-term affordable housing solutions. For more information on the Erase project, please feel free to contact Senior Project Director Sarah Gallagher at sgallagher@nlihc.org or myself at jvasquez@nlihc.org. And I'll drop some links in the chat for those that are interested. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jade, for that excellent presentation and for those resources. And I am looking in the chat box. And there are some questions about which states and which organizations are collaborators on the Erase project at this point. Are those going to be listed on the website?
Those are listed on the website. You can actually, if you go to the Erase cohort and you scroll down, you can see the logos of all the organizations represented on the cohort. And so we have 35 total right now. And so you can see that on the website.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jade, for this information and for these resources that we will also, as a reminder, share with everyone in the follow-up email. Outside of that, I will say thanks to everyone for attending today's call, and thanks to our excellent presenters, our excellent field updates, and we will see all of you next week. But before I sign off, I just want to include one more reminder that if you haven't already done so, or in fact, even if you have already done so, please reach out to your members of Congress today and let them know that you're relying on them to weigh in with the White House and to weigh in with leadership in Congress about specifically affordable housing investments that will impact extremely low-income people, the lowest income renters. We really need to make sure we don't miss this moment because, as Senator Merkley pointed out, it's not like this window will be open forever. We won't have many chances like this to really get a massive infusion of impactful housing resources. So please reach out today, and thank you, everyone. Goodbye.